this one slide where you have a chance to go ahead and click in and share where you're from in the world. So I think if you haven't done this before, on the left-hand side you should see an icon of a little sun, and you can click where you're located. We'll get a feel for that. And as we're doing this as well, what I'd like to invite you to do in the chat box is if you could share a little bit about your background. So I'm especially interested in where you're coming from in terms of the title of this conference. So there's homeschooling, unschooling, and alternative schooling, or if you're in a more traditional school setting, or all of the above. If you don't mind just in the chat box sharing a little bit of where you fit in those categories, that would be helpful. Welcome, Cindy. We're just taking a little bit of time sharing about our own backgrounds. I was asking people to type in the chat box about their own experiences, whether they're in the homeschool sector, a traditional school, an alternative school, unschooling. Jamie, that is exciting. I'm in my early years of homeschooling myself, so that's amazing. That's exciting. Well, very good. Feel free to go ahead and share a little bit about yourself so that you can get to know one another as we have this conversation together. This is a webinar, and I know it's pretty linear typically, and I do have some content to share with you, and I know people come expecting that, so I'll be sure to provide it. Also, if you're interested, almost everything that I present on around the country or around the world, I usually share in a rough draft format in my blog. So I'll type a link to it here in the chat, and you're welcome to follow along, and feel free to post comments, agree, disagree, ask questions, contribute new ideas or thoughts. I pretty much test out all my ideas there now. I write, well, in the last year I got pretty involved, and I think I've written over 200 articles in the last 4 months, just refining ideas, some that will possibly turn into books in the upcoming year or two. Others have turned into presentations, keynote presentations at different places. A little bit about myself. I'm located, I'm the star that's just to the, it's actually covering Lake Michigan right now, but I'm in Mequon, Wisconsin, about 30 miles north of Milwaukee. And I serve at Concordia University, Wisconsin. We're a private university of about 8,000 students, and I am Assistant Vice President of Academics and an Associate Professor of Education. One of my roles is working with our Office of Continuing and Distance Education, and in that role I consider it my job to sort of challenge us as a university to consider new possibilities wherever they might reside. I also do quite a bit of consulting, especially for alternative schools and charter schools. My wife and I are homeschool. Our 2 children are 6 and 9, so we're just getting started in this homeschooling experience, and it's great fun. We also have a little bit of fear and trepidation as there are a lot of unknowns for us. So as I share with you today, some of what I'm sharing will come from my research, some of it will come from my own experiences, and I welcome you. We have a wealth of experience in the room, so please jump in and share your own thoughts and ideas as well. Now, in terms of this particular presentation, the creation versus consumption, let me just jump ahead here. The idea from this arose as I was having a conversation with my daughter. And we do let our children have a little bit of screen time, and we have some iPads in the house that we use for research and different things like that. And my children, I'll let them play on the iPads, and they'll select different apps. And one day I was realizing that the apps that my children were gravitating toward were ones that I would have wished that they would have maybe chosen some others. They were playing a lot of games, and those were fine, but they were also, they were doing a lot of consumption. They were watching a lot of videos and things like that, and it's fun, and I love to see that sort of interest. But I realized that I'd like to challenge them to be involved in a little more creation as well. So I explored and downloaded a dozen or so apps that allowed one to create a little bit more than just to consume. So we created a little bit of a rule around the house where when the kids are on the iPad, if they spend a certain amount of time in consumption apps, then I encourage them to spend some time in creation. And I don't enforce that strictly or anything, but it's become a vocabulary for us in our household to talk about creation and consumption. And it's also started to impact and influence the way our family thinks about our time together in our lives and our involvement in the world. And that really personal kind of experience is where this topic has come from. It's also come from the fact that I've studied alternative schools for about 5 years now. I've conducted a number of case studies and visited over 40 schools where I spent quite a bit of time interviewing and visiting, interviewing students and instructors. And one of my early research projects that came from that was traits of leaders of these innovative schools, and I found that there were really 10 traits that kept popping up across all of the schools. And then my attention focused more on the students, and I became very interested in the project-based learning schools and various schools where students develop personalized learning plans, and that largely drove their work. So another personal anecdote, I've been involved in the Concordia is tied to the Lutheran system, the Lutheran school system, and so I have a strong commitment to that Lutheran school system because that's part of what nurtured me growing up. And that's what I always expected that I would do for my kids. And I visited a project-based learning school, one of my early project-based learning schools. And after having a few conversations with some of the young people there and hearing about these amazing projects, I was driving home and I found myself actually crying. And I wasn't quite sure why, and I realized that it was because I wanted something different for my kids than what that school system I thought I was going to send them to was able to provide. And that really just motivated me even further. So much of my work also is taking ideas from homeschooling and unschooling and alternative schoolings and other types of models and sharing them with traditional schools and inviting them to reconsider or to consider new possibilities. But as a parent, I still find it hard to beat homeschooling. So let's go ahead and jump in here a little bit. Here's kind of my point. I'll share with you my point up front. That education is not adequately equipping people for life in the constantly changing 21st century landscape unless it places a high priority on learning to grow and learn by tinkering, writing, designing, building, planning, and creating. Our capacity to create is rapidly becoming one of the most universal currencies of the digital age. So that statement there, that's pretty much my claim, and we're going to explore that in one way or another throughout this time together. So you've probably seen the famous TED Talk called Schools Kill Creativity. These 3 books are also popular ones, but they approach the topic from different angles. Richard Florida looks at the rise of the creative class. I'm going to stop just for a second. There was a question. Marty, are you unable to see the slides? Let me see my setting. I'm new to Blackboard Collaborate. I've used Adobe Connect mostly in the past. Debbie, are you able to give me a tip or two to make sure that I am progressing through the slides properly? I see it on my
Yes, I went ahead and put up now you have education is set. Now your slide is there. Okay, you're good to go.
Perfect. Thank you very much. Great. So Schools Kill Creativity, the other books, Richard Florida looks at this more from kind of a broader perspective, the rise of the creative class, arguing that this capacity for creativity is really going to be a key currency in the moving forward. And this book is older, and it's certainly come true as we see ourselves coming into what many people describe as a knowledge economy and so forth. We have Howard Gardner, who's most known for his book on multiple intelligences still, when he wrote Frames of Mind quite a long time ago now, over 2 decades ago. And then this older book, he actually wrote as an essay back in the 1990s, and it turned into a book later, where he argues for 5 minds of the future, and one of those minds is called the creating mind. And then we have a newer book. I'm not sure how many of you have seen or read this one. that came out called Invent to Learn, Making Tinkering and Engineering in the Classroom. And this one has a very strong STEM focus to it in terms of its tinkering and making. It really resonates with the whole makerspace movement today. I'm going to spend a little less time on the makerspace movement, but if people have comments or questions or thoughts, I'm happy to explore them with you. So let's define our terms here quickly. If we start at the bottom, early 15th century, it was interesting to note that consumer was defined as one who squanders or wastes. That's one of the two definitions that I saw. I thought that was an interesting way to approach it. And I think as we look at our society today, that might be pretty accurate in terms of consumer culture and maybe how we've taken things. Two other definitions, though. One who uses products and services from a producer, and then one who receives what's provided by the instructor, the software, or the producer. That second one really being a consumer within an educational context. Now the next one then is just the definition for a producer. And I took a simple definition from the book Free, How Today's Smartest Businesses Profit from Giving Something for Nothing. And I like the definition for producer, so I pulled out part of it. And I'm really arguing that a producer, in terms of a production quotient, is one who makes, grows, or supplies things. I like the word create as well. Creates, makes, grows, and supplies things. So that's sort of where I'm working from. As we get started here, let's take a moment and just reflect about our own experiences in today. So I know that we have different time zones. For some of you, it may be early morning. But we're going to go to an open slide here, and let's try. You should be able to click on the little icon with the A, and you could type. And what I'd like you to do is type, what are some things that you have consumed today? You can type anywhere you want on the screen. We'll just sort of create a random brainstorm together. What are things that you've consumed? It could be food, it could be words or ideas, it could be presentations. We have 23 people in the room, so we should get a nice brainstorm here pretty quickly. Feel free to be specific. If it was a specific book that you read or a website that you remember seeing. Plenty of homeschool presentations I see. Pinterest recipes. Oh, my blog. Oh, okay, very good. RSS feeds, I'm addicted to those as well. I think I have 500 unread ones sitting there for me now. Gasoline. We'll give it another 20 seconds or so. Feel free to go ahead and type in. And you can use the chat on the side if you prefer that. I just sort of like the brainstorm look and feel as well sometimes. The energy for these seminars, sure. The cookies. That's the one downside for these virtual presentations. The snacks just aren't up to par, are they? I guess you could bring your own. All right, very good. Well, let's switch over now, and let's take a moment. Oops, I switched my questions. Now let's go to the question of what have you produced today? What have you created or made or produced? Okay, I'm assuming the eggs were being cooked. We didn't produce the eggs, but we made them. Right? We prepared the eggs. Very good. A fig salad. Ooh, that sounds good. Blog posts, food, online classes, data visualization. And I think we could even get more, if we get sort of abstract, we might come up with other things that we produce, things that aren't necessarily tangible, but other things we might produce in terms of a new idea or a new concept or We produced something in the form of a conversation or a relationship we were building with another person. Understanding between two friends. There we go. As I think about this, it's interesting because I've actually noticed, and I don't have any research to support this, and it probably relates to some of our own individual proclivities and preferences. Feel free to go ahead and continue to type a little bit as I'm talking here for a moment. But I've noticed that in my own experience that when my creation-consumption quotient, when those seem to become off balance, that I find a lot less dissatisfaction. I can get a little bit down or things like that. Sometimes I am over-consuming without an outlet to really create or produce anything with it. In fact, it's even a health danger, isn't it, to over-consume but not maybe burn any energy with what we've consumed. That can cause all sorts of health concerns. The same thing I suggest might even be the case as we think about ideas. So I read voraciously. I read probably 100 to 150 books a year. I read a minimum of 1 book a week, but oftentimes I get through 2 or 3 books. And that's partially my vocation as a scholar, as a professor, and so forth, but it's also just part of my DNA, as I love to read. But if I did only that, I find myself getting sort of lost or frustrated or down. I need an outlet to do something with it. And so I find that it's really valuable for me to look for this balance between creation and consumption. And that's why, as I mentioned before, a blog plays an important role for me as I share my ideas with others and brainstorm. I mentioned before that I've written over 200 articles just this year, and they're flowing from maybe one sentence that came from a book, and I expanded it, and I maybe considered a new angle to it and ended up writing a post about it. And that's really that creation consumption piece that we're talking about. I'm not going to argue that we should only have learning experiences that are creation alone. In fact, creation without some consumption is pretty hard to do for many of us. But let's go ahead and just dive into this. As I look at this, I do believe that maybe we've overemphasized consumption in many circumstances and underemphasized creation. And one of the evidence of that is when we look at the way that people deal with information. So we have more information available to us today than was available to anyone at any time in history. If we go back far enough, we could find a time when one person in their own lifetime could read every book that was in print. And yet today, that's obviously not feasible. The number of books in print and the number of text on web pages and things like that, it just wouldn't be possible for a single person to read that much. In fact, I just wrote a blog post the other day where I was looking up some research on this, and let me see, I'll just open it up for myself to remind me of it. But 3.5 billion web pages, 181 million blogs, over 10,000 digital versions of newspapers on the web, 129 million different books in print, and the average person sends and receives over 110 emails every day. And so we live in this culture, this environment where information, I believe that addiction is really accurate, and there has even been some research to indicate the way that the brain responds to sort of the clicking from page to page on the web, that you get these minuscule, these tiny dopamine fixes, these releases that motivate you to click to the next and the next and the next. I noticed this first whenever I was a middle school teacher, and we started to do presentations, and sometimes students would be working on developing a PowerPoint presentation or something like that. And I found that some of the students would spend 80%, without guidance or direction, they would spend 80 or 90% of their time on clip art. And then I noticed that teachers were doing the exact same thing, that they needed to find just that right piece of clip art for the presentation, and they would spend a mass amount of time with looking at gathering all of these images and sort of hunting for more information. I've also seen it with people when they're working on research projects, and they feel as if the majority of the job is complete once they've culminated a massive pile of articles or resources. And yet, we all know that that's just the beginning stage. Now one has to analyze and synthesize and create something meaningful and substantive out of that pile. And yet, information addiction sometimes keeps us stuck in that first part of the experience. collecting and collecting and collecting and feeling these quick fixes and these feelings of reward, but it doesn't allow us to produce anything of substance necessarily if we just stay there. The other perspective would be sort of the academic pack rat concept of the person who wants to learn and collect more things. I'm a little addicted to school. So as much as I have a vision for self-directed learning and things like that, I've studied at over 20 universities and have a handful of degrees and things like that. And I sort of collect courses and degrees and even content and knowledge, as if the goal is for me just to have as much knowledge as possible in my mind and in my brain. And yet, again, what's the purpose of that? Toward what end? So that's really where I start to think about the role of cultivating a greater creation consumption in our own lives and encouraging the learners around us of all ages to cultivate a larger creation consumption. I was really delighted whenever I had a conversation with my daughter the other day, and I asked her this question. She's 9 years old, and I said to her, what's your favorite subject? And she said, well, history and science. And then I realized I really framed that question in sort of a traditional schooling model, your favorite subject or your favorite class. And so we don't even always experience it as a subject or a class. And so then I pushed it a little bit further, and I said to her, well, you said science is your favorite subject. What is science? And she said, you know, Dad, it's when you go outside and do experiments. And that really caught my attention. And that I was delighted, because that's my hope and that's my dream, is that that's what will happen more in our own family. And I think we could all benefit from that sort of a mindset. Is science, when we think of it, a textbook where we memorize facts and terms and phrases, or is science when we go out and we experiment and we explore and we discover and we create as a part of that? So I'm going to take us through 10 different approaches to cultivating a higher creation quotient in our lives and in the lives of others. And I've intentionally chosen these items, some to be a little more mild, that could be integrated within a traditional school environment, and some that maybe push the boundaries, and they probably wouldn't work in a traditional school environment, but they might work really well in a homeschool environment or even on an individual basis. So the first way is to simply tie reading and writing. And I know that this doesn't seem like a huge deal or earth-shattering. Again, I'm trying to pick some that are more tame and others that are a little more wild. But this one is simply the idea of creation as the creation of derivative works. I noted in my blog that I post a lot of articles, and oftentimes the articles that I post are derivative works. I get one nugget of an idea from somewhere, and then I just cultivate it, and I feed it, and I mull over it, and I try to create something out of it, something that may have hardly any relationship at all to the initial idea, but it's that one little piece that sort of sparked it. We do that sometimes by listening to a piece of music, and then maybe want to create our own song or play something. We might do that by having a wonderful conversation with a person, and then we create something meaningful out of that conversation that's tangible, maybe a physical object or something in writing. From my perspective, I see this as a way of honoring that conversation or honoring the book. In fact, one of my last slides, I'm going to talk about a concept of how I frame this whole vision of creation and where the meaning comes in it. When I read a book, I think about the author, and I think about honoring the author that I'm reading. And one of the ways that we honor another person is that we listen to them. We give them our full undivided attention, and we ask questions of them. Of course, an author isn't always alive or close enough to answer, although on the web you can do that, and I actually take advantage of that quite often, where I'll hunt down the author on the web and email them a question. But one of the ways we honor someone is that we listen to them, and we attend to them, and we really take seriously what they have to offer, even if we totally disagree with it. And so one way that we can think about cultivating a creation quotient is when we experience something where we are consuming, whether I'm reading something or I'm listening to something, we take the time to commemorate it with a creation or a derivative work. It could be a short poem, if you're creative in that sense. It could be a paragraph, something that we enter in a journal, a short song that we write, a phrase that we sort of internalize and make a part of our own vocabulary. and we use that person or that conversation, we sort of quote them, as this friend of mine always says. And so we actually create something out of it. That's one way of approaching this creation quotient. The second one is creative consumption. How many of you are familiar with the learning in depth movement? I think we have a polling tool, so there's a little checkbox. You can click yes if you've heard of it, and the X no if you haven't heard of it. Okay, the no's are outnumbering the yeses quite a bit here. So let me just take a moment and explain it. There's a link here, and you can jot that down and visit it later. I think I have a couple of blog posts that review the learning in depth movement as well. It seems to have come out of Canada and spread into the USA as well. And it's a vision that takes where you work with a kindergartner, and it's happening in traditional schools oftentimes, and they have a ceremony, and every kindergartner is assigned, and they're assigned. They're not actually given the freedom to choose in this particular instance, but they're assigned a word. And they have some criterion on the website for which kinds of words are useful and which are not. But some would be things like bridges, mountains, cats. They're oftentimes concrete. Thank you, Debbie, for adding that. They're oftentimes very concrete. But then here's the interesting challenge. Up until they finish high school, in these schools that go K-12, that is their word. And their challenge, their invitation, is to become a world-renowned expert in everything that has to do with that word. And so now they're going to be consuming quite a bit of knowledge and information in the process. So for example, suppose you're learning about cats. You might study the biology of cats. You might learn about the different types of cats and so forth. You might learn about caring for cats as a pet. You might look at different mistreatments of cats and how people are trying to respond to that. You might look at the reference to cats in literature and in poetry. Or what about different cultural perspectives and what role symbolically cats might have in ancient Egypt or in other parts of the world. And so for their entire school career, essentially, their traditional school career, they are exploring this from all sorts of imaginable angles. And what they argue is that by doing this, it teaches resilience, it cultivates creativity, because they're looking at the same topic from so many different angles and they're exploring it. It affords the learners a chance for self-direction, where they can decide where they want to take things. And they have a list of skills that they argue that it cultivates. But this is one example of what I would define as creative consumption, where we're still learning a lot, and we're actually learning content, but we're also creating all sorts of meaningful artifacts from it, and we're using creativity. We're making new paths for ourselves as we go about consuming and learning. Another one, so this is just another example of consuming to create. And more simply, consuming to create is simply the idea that we are exploring knowledge and we're gathering it in order to create something meaningful. And we'll talk about what those meaningful things can be. I'm sure everyone in here has experience with different projects and things like that. But this is where we're consuming with the goal of using that knowledge to create something down the road. Now this is an example of the flipped classroom. So there are a lot of this is a popular buzzword out there of the flipped classroom. I'm sure that many of you have heard of it. Let me just get some check marks though, just to test that, not test my assumption there. If you've heard of the flipped classroom, please click yes. If you haven't, click no. Okay, so I'll let you keep voting there, but that's very helpful. Thank you. The idea of the flipped classroom, it actually emerged. It was first called the inverted classroom, and one of its first references historically, if we look at the literature, goes back to a college professor who was experimenting with recording his lectures. I believe it was in math or engineering, and he made the lectures available to the learners prior to class. And then they would come to class, they would watch the lectures, and then they would come to class, and class time would be where they would do their homework. And so the benefit was that the instructor would be available to help the learners as they had questions and as they struggled. Previously, the instructor had done lectures in class, and out of class, the learners did their homework, but they often got stuck, and they had no one to guide them or help them. And so the flipped classroom was a model. Now, what I have here is this is a model for those who want to try the flipped classroom. It doesn't just have to be lecture content. I created a 3-step process, and I used the metaphor or the analogy of dating to describe it. The before class activities are, if you think of it as dating, that's a nice to meet you. That's when you first meet a person. Or in terms of the flipped classroom, that's usually meeting the idea or the content. So from Bloom's taxonomy, down at the bottom, that's where we talk about lower levels of thinking, like remembering, learning to remember and understand, getting to know the vocabulary. That might come from some readings that students pursue, videos that they watch, introduction to concepts in different ways. And then there might be little checks for understanding, like an ungraded quiz just to see if I know it or not. And some teachers in school settings even have students, they have to get an entry ticket. So they have to get an 8 out of 10, no grade, but they have to get an 8 out of 10 to come before they come to class. So they come to class with a basic knowledge of the content. And then they come to class, and during class they do projects and problems and small groups and discussions and labs, and they create things and they analyze things. So it gives them more time to dig deep now that people came with sort of a baseline knowledge of the subject. And they do more checking for understanding. From the dating analogy, that's let's do something together. That's sort of the first date. And then afterward, now that the learners had a chance to sort of practice the ideas with some feedback, and this is largely a method that people are using in something like math, where people might want a little extra guidance or direction. Afterward, then, this is where people are sort of unleashed to go on their own and to create projects and papers and creative items with the idea without any guidance. So you notice beforehand, basic ideas. In class, they get to create things, and then after class, they also get to create things more independently. So here's an example within a more traditional environment of a way that you can increase the creation quotient, where there's some consumption at the beginning, but then you really free up a lot of the time in class and then post-class to do more creative activities. Another one I mentioned before was I mentioned this example early on, so I won't spend much time with it, in terms of the iPad and technology, for those of you that are fans of that. So the iPad, I had a strong criticism of the iPad when it first came out. A lot of schools adopted the iPad and they were getting into one-to-one programs before there was any research or any evidence that it was necessarily going to be a really positive thing for student learning. And my critique of it initially was, I'm very concerned that this is going to just increase the consumption, that it's a good consumption device, that people can watch videos, visit web pages, go through tutorials, they can play basic games. But a lot of that was lower level on this Bloom's taxonomy. They're not at those higher levels of analyzing things, evaluating things, and creating things. And that was my critique. And yet now there is some promise because I've seen more apps that are being developed that do have a creative element to them. So whenever I look at my own iPad, for example, I keep for my kids, there are things like GarageBand where you can do editing and you can create podcasts and you can create other sorts of interviews with background music. There are fun little apps that allow you to create your own comics. There's one called Text Here, another one called Kaboom. There are some that allow you to create these little puppet pal kind of interactions between characters, and it seems a little childish. And well, it is childish and it's fun, but I actually I like creating them myself. And you can demonstrate some real knowledge in a creative way. One called Puppet Pals, for example. And you can create these stop-motion videos where you capture images and then you narrate a story over them. Very easy to use to do those sorts of things. So there are a lot of creation apps that have emerged. So I do see some promise for using technology for creation, at least in some ways. A big improvement. Oh, thanks, Michelle. I noticed you said your son was using stop motion for geometry. Very, very neat. Okay, this next one I will go into a lot of depth, but this one is a little more challenging, but it's pretty exciting. These are two wonderful books. If you're interested in this whole movement of games and learning, the idea of gamification is really looking at games, whether it's a video game or a traditional board game, and looking at the principles that make the game so engaging. So why is it that a fifth grader can be lost in a video game for 3 or 4 hours without a bathroom break, but within 15 minutes of a traditional classroom, they're falling asleep or they're bored? And so this movement is looking at the idea of games and saying, well, maybe we can learn a little bit about what motivates us and what sort of keeps us attentive as we explore different ideas. And these two books explore that from a couple of different perspectives. But the one on the left I pose as a neat possibility because it actually suggests ways that you can design games. And I've been a large advocate of that. So less so about adding a bunch of games to the classroom or to a traditional school environment, more about what if we unleashed students with a chance to create their own games. They learn about rules, and they learn about the rules of game design. They learn about what contributes to a game that's engaging and sort of keeps people going. Or what if we even learn about gamification principles that we can use in our own lives? I know some people, how many of you use something like the Fitbit or one of those other devices to keep you a little bit motivated to climb the steps in the day or take so many steps or so forth? So some of those things, that's a use of gamification in our own lives. And some people like Jane McGonigal, Reality is Broken. She wrote a book called Reality is Broken. She seems to argue that games can really save the world or save us from our greatest problems in the world. I'm not that optimistic about games, but I do think there are some wonderful principles that we might be able to learn from them. And I think it can become especially powerful if we actually invite the learners to do the game design, not just play the games. The next one is the idea of a personal learning network. Now, in the field of education, people have been talking about personal learning networks for a long time, for at least 6 or 7 years or more, and it's usually a phrase referred to a teacher learning to create a network of people and resources that they use to learn in an ongoing way. So in essence, it's creating this kind of visual or written map of the different ways that you go about learning new things. So for me, I might have the library as one of the nodes in my network. I have certain go-to people that I love brainstorming with and talking to. I have my Twitter friends. I have people that I connect with on LinkedIn. And I also have journals that I read, websites and blogs that I frequent. And you all have similar things probably as well. Perhaps yours are more in the physical world, some of you more in the digital world, more a blend. What I'm arguing here, though, is that we take the opportunity to invite the learners of all ages to design their own personal learning networks and to document it as a way to become more aware of how they go about learning. But in doing so, they're intentionally and consciously creating a network for learning. So with my children, already starting to ask them about where are the places that you go when you want to learn something new or when you have a question. And they begin to brainstorm with me about how they might use Google, or they like going to the public library, or they like asking mom, or they like calling grandpa, or they begin to think about the different people that they value for learning different things. And as we make that more conscious and more aware, they become that much more intentional about designing their own learning network and sort of taking control of it, and even weeding things out of their network that they find to be unhelpful or harmful in some ways. And it's neat to see my own daughter starting to make theories about what is helpful in her learning network and what isn't necessarily very helpful in her network. So this can be kind of a way of making or creating, but we're actually creating a network, a learning network. So we've heard this phrase, the best way to learn is to teach, and the best I can tell is it actually came from Frank Oppenheimer, but that's one of those quotes that's become so popularized that it's hard to know where it actually originated from. But I'll suggest that teaching can be powerful, as many of us have seen in our own experiences working with young people and people of all ages. When I work with teachers in schools, I often suggest these 4 strategies, but I think they can work in many ways, or in many contexts. The first one is just a simple how I did it exercise. So in traditional schools, oftentimes children are challenged to solve a problem or complete a math problem or do something or write a paper, and sometimes they are affirmed for how well they did in it. And then you move on. There's little time, or maybe it's artwork and they put it up on the wall to celebrate and to recognize what they did, and they share their work with others. But what didn't happen in many of those contexts is the chance to give the learner, or the creator, a chance to share how they did it. How did I solve this problem? Was it challenging? Did I get stuck and then I worked through that? And how did I work through it? And when I was frustrated, how did I learn to sort of work through the frustration, or did I need to take a break? What strategies did I use to work through this math problem? Or when I drew this picture, what techniques did I use? And so as we invite them to start to articulate these things, this helps the learner develop a more nuanced understanding of what they're doing as they make this conscious, but they're also sharing their creative work with others. And that adds some motivation as well as we see the benefit that we have something to offer to other people as we're teaching them how we did it. Another one is, I give a very specific example. I call it the zoo tour because I realized this whenever I was at the zoo with my kids. My wife was working on her doctorate and she had weekend classes for 3 years. And so during those weekends, those became the museum tours and trips with my children and myself. And we went to the zoo one time, and I remember that was also the first time I saw they were actually using iPads for therapy with the apes. That's an interesting experiment. Sorry for that aside. But I was with my kids, and we were going through the zoo, and I started asking them questions because we'd been to the zoo several times, and they had quite a bit of knowledge that they gained. My daughter had read many of the descriptions. And so I pulled out my camera, and I decided we'd start to do a bit of a documentary where my daughter would go up to an exhibit, my daughter would start to present about this exhibit and share some things that she observed and some facts that maybe people wouldn't typically know when they went to the zoo. And my daughter and son took turns going back and forth and practicing, and it certainly wasn't a polished or high-quality documentary of any sort, and yet in the process they were teaching someone, some unknown person. We got to share pieces of it with the grandparents in that case, but they were also learning as they were refining their own thinking about it. A third one is find, solve, and share. So this is an opportunity and a challenge that I often give to teachers in more traditional school settings where maybe they don't have a lot of self-directed learning happening in the classroom. Much of it is directed by the teacher. I often give this challenge to the teachers as I say, well, what if you just took over each quarter one find, solve, and share challenge where the students have a challenge of finding something of personal interest and meaning that relates to the content in the course. But finding something that is actually a problem in the world or an issue in the world. And to come up with some potential solutions, some recommendations for how to solve that or how to move forward or how to address that. And then have a time to share that with the class. And I encourage them to break up into small groups throughout the semester and meet and to share their rough draft ideas with one another as well. So it's not just sort of a final event, but they're sharing this. Very informal. I encourage them also in the traditional school setting. I say, and try doing it without a letter grade. Just encourage them to do this and challenge them to do something that's of personal meaning. Maybe it's a pass or fail or there's no grade attached to it at all. I get a lot of really great feedback from traditional classroom teachers who try this and they find it to be very, very rewarding. And it's also a great way, I found, for teachers who maybe have a little more traditional perspective on the classroom to imagine the possibilities for self-directed learning, even in a traditional school setting. Of course, this can work well in a home-based learning environment and all sorts of other environments as well. The fourth one is peer teaching with teaching aids. Notice peer teaching is really common. It's especially common in homeschooling where children of different ages are helping one another and teaching one another. And I'm just taking it the next step here and noting that with teaching aids, so that the person is taking such care to teach the other person that they're actually creating artifacts, whether it's a written guide or a metaphor or an illustration or an example, and they're creating resources that they can pass on to that other learner. And that can become powerful too, where learners could be creating, there could be a repository online where homeschoolers, for example, and maybe there is one that I'm not even aware of, where homeschoolers are teaching homeschoolers by creating teaching aids that they could kind of pass on to one another. I'm curious, if any of you know of something like that that exists, I'd love to hear about it. The next one is creating in terms of creating spaces. This comes from a recent blog post that I wrote, and I wrote it for teachers coming back to school, but it was actually coming back to school this year. It was actually inspired by thinking about the spaces in our own home as we think about homeschooling our own children. I've been reading and studying quite a bit about what goes into designing great spaces, and one of my favorite books on the topic is called Make Space: How to Set the Stage for Creative Collaboration. And this is a book that describes the process of the creation of Stanford D School, their design school, and the spaces inside of that school. And what's so neat is when you first look at the book, it might just not even seem relevant to you. But then you notice and you read the little call-outs by the pictures and things like that. It doesn't read like just a book front to back. You can jump around pretty easily in it. you find that every single thing is so intentional. And so specific, and they make very intentional design considerations. So, for example, the desks that they sit at are not tall enough to stand at, and they're not quite short enough to sit at in a traditional way. They're somewhere in between, and they were created that way in order to kind of keep people a little bit on edge, like they're always a little bit on the move. And that was one of the intentions for that space. They created other spaces that are really comfortable kind of squares that you sit on, but if you stay on them for more than 20 minutes, they're completely uncomfortable. And so it's a place to kind of have these 15, 20-minute discussions and then move on spaces. And I think about this in terms of giving learners a chance to design their own spaces, whether it's in a traditional school or in their home, and building spaces that are creative and rich and inspiring. So one is the disciplinary decor. This is the kind of space where you pick a content area and you create like the Hall of History, and it's maybe a particular era in history, and the whole space is designed around that. Or you might pick a science lab, and maybe you create kind of a mad scientist lab. But this isn't the teacher creating it. These are the learners creating it and designing the space and thinking about what would inspire them to think more about this topic. Truth, beauty, and goodness. So that's from the traditional, classical, sort of liberal arts. And I still think those are valuable. And inviting learners to create spaces that remind them of things that they think are true, things that they think are beautiful, things they find to be good. And using this as sort of a space that's inspiring for them. The third would be called the classroom canvas, or an etch-a-sketch room. And this is where you create a space that literally allows you to continually create and recreate. So an etch-a-sketch, right? You draw something, you shake it, and then you start over. That's the idea of the classroom canvas. And this is where people might create, you create the whiteboard walls so they can write on the walls, you have chalkboards, you have things that people can hang and draw on, but you create it so that we can sort of create the space, tear it down, and start over. And it's a place where we can create a blank canvas and start over again and do that multiple times. And these are places to create ideas that inspire them or ideas that help them learn. The fourth one is a little bit of a different focus, and this is where you create a space that's largely graphic organizers. So these are visuals like Venn diagrams and things that help you to understand the relationships between ideas that you're studying. These are learning tools. Think of this as kind of the mathematician's lab, where they have different charts and visuals, but they're things to kind of trigger their memory and remind them of these different ideas. And thank you, Tammy. Lots of great mind mapping tools. I'll try to find it, but Howard Rheingold actually has a great list over on, I believe it's Delicious. I'm not going to find it in time though, but there's some out there. You can find lots of lists of great mind mapping and concept mapping tools for digital creation as well. And then the Hall of Fame is where you create a visual space of people that inspire you, and maybe even you jot down little comments about why they inspire you, and this can be a really powerful thing. And so you can change that as you go, and maybe these are historical figures or others. In an era where we seem to be deconstructing and tearing down every hero in our history, it might be valuable for our learners to take the chance to lift up some heroes in their own lives, people that they're familiar with, or in their own friendships and relationships, or they're familiar with through literature or history or science or something like that. I was looking, so there was a comment I wanted to follow here about kids need time, space, resources, and a way to share creativity. Yeah, absolutely agreed. And one of the challenges of homeschooling, providing a stimulating environment, seems expensive sometimes. You know, Terry, I know we've talked about that as well, my wife and I, homeschooling, and we do invest quite a bit in that. And we created one room that right now is actually pretty messy. I know that actually this week my wife and kids are sort of reimagining that space, but we put down some flooring that can be kind of destructible so that they can paint in that room, because it has like bird's eye maple underneath, so it just has just a sort of cheap flooring. And then we have some white paint that we put on the walls, and so ours is pretty low key, but we've been playing around with this idea. We largely have been gravitating toward kind of a mix of the number 3, the Etch-a-Sketch room, and then some of number 4, the graphic organizer or learning tools in our own usage. So the next one is project-based learning, and this could be its own presentation. In fact, I've given 2 or 3 day seminars on project-based learning alone, this topic. And there are a lot of resources out there, and if one's doing it in the school setting, sometimes they do it really formally and they plan it out as this big unit plan and so forth. But when I look at project-based learning, the components that I see as really valuable that keep students motivated and make it a meaningful learning experience is one, that there's some kind of strategy for motivation. So whether it's giving the learner a chance to choose their own topics and explore what interests them, whether it's if it's a little more teacher or parent directed, or maybe the parent introduces them to something that's motivating, that maybe it's a captivating video or a story or something like that, but it introduces the possible project. The driving question, it can be teacher directed or it can invite students to create a question. And I call a driving question a provocative one. So for example, if you were studying about aerodynamics, learning objectives in schools are not provocative and they're not interesting or motivating. They're boring and they're written in a way that just sounds boring oftentimes. But a driving question is something that compels you to want to know more. For example, if I were teaching aerodynamics, my driving question would be, why do some things fly and others not? And that's the driving question. So we try to get at a question. And in fact, I wrote an article recently on my blog about the importance of teaching ourselves and others to learn to ask questions. And why don't we even assess by the questions we ask and not just the answers we give? One of my colleagues who might even be in the room, he was sharing that with me the other day. And then, so after they ask the question, then they dig deeply into exploring and finding answers to the question, and they create one or more culminating artifacts, whether it's a speech or a presentation or a piece of art or it's something physical in terms of actual, like if it were the why things fly, maybe they create different items that fly well and others that don't fly well. They come up with explanations for that. It requires adequate resources. So what do the learners need? If students have done a lot of self-directed learning and they're really independent,
All right, we should be good. Actually, just right through the computer.
All right, can you hear me all right? I apologize. I just had one of those horrendous blue screen experiences on my computer. My computer completely shut down. I'm so fortunate that one of my colleagues actually was in the room, and so I just jumped over to his computer. Could you guys just confirm that you can hear me all right now? Ah, perfect. Great. Thanks a lot. Well, I'll finish up here in a minute or two so that we have time for Q&A as well. That was a little scary. I've never had that happen with a webinar before. Debbie, I do not have the rights for moving forward on the slides, though, so if you could help me in a minute, that'd be great. So project-based learning, I'll just finish up here. So resources may be needed depending on how much experience they do or don't have. In terms of background with self-directed learning and independence. And then those so sometimes learners will need more feedback if they haven't done this kind of a project before, because they can get a little nervous, right? They don't know if they're progressing in the right direction. So feedback loops may be really important for them. And then I would argue that the last part that makes these really powerful would be an authentic audience. So once I'm done with my project, does it just go in a desk drawer, or do I share it with someone outside of my class or outside of my home? Do I share it with family members or friends or the community or on the web to get feedback from others? That becomes really compelling, really powerful. And in fact, I work with schools. I volunteer my services to home school co-ops and classroom teachers and others. Like once or twice a semester, I just volunteer for free to work with people to design something that they think would be fun. And I'm sort of an assistant and do whatever. They want me to pick up the trash, I'll do that. They want me to help design, I'll do that. They want me to help lead. So I play that role. And one of them I did recently was a really neat example of a project where students had written an essay, and
it was an expository essay, but we wanted to do something a little more exciting and interesting with it and take it deeper. So we brought in a poet who talked about the power of the spoken word, and the students learned to speak their writing with eloquence. And then we brought in a photographer, and they talked about how images can enhance the written word. And the students went out and took pictures that went along with their essay. And then we brought in a musician who talked about how music can enhance the word, and the written word. And then they found background music. And then they created these digital stories of their essays with background music and images and really well spoken. Their voice was articulate. They were talking about enunciating. It was fun to hear fifth graders saying, "Oh, I don't think I enunciated correctly in that instance." And so that's pretty powerful. And then the part that made it really significant, though, was at the end they had a grandparents' night, and all the grandparents came and they shared their videos with all the grandparents in the room. And it was just such a hit, and it was so exciting to see the energy and the excitement on the young people's faces. That's the power of having an authentic audience for a project. Okay, Debbie, can you help me go to the next slide? And we'll just finish up here for at least a couple minutes of Q&A. We'll skip number 9, if you can just go on, and number 10 and 11. I'll finish with this one. So another one, and this one I call, it's a fancy word. It comes from Henry Jenkins out in the West Coast, talks about transmedia migration. You can Google that if you want to learn more about it. But what I mean is transmedia creation is they do one creative activity, and from that they create others. So for example, maybe it starts with part of the science experience for the young people is they're going to create a garden in their backyard, or if it's a school, they'll create it in the field behind the school, and they'll garden and they'll learn about gardening, and they'll capture images and they'll study what's happening there, and they'll learn about the insects and how to keep them from eating their food, and they'll learn all that stuff over an extended period of time as they garden. But then they created the garden, and that's one piece. But then they create a photo essay. They create a diary of what they're learning and thinking as they do this. They create video series on YouTube to share with others who are trying to create a community garden, perhaps. They might write short stories about life in the garden. And so we took this one area, and they're creating multiple pieces all along the way. And there's plenty of consumption happening. They're learning a lot, and they're consuming, but it's all driven by this creative endeavor. Debbie, can we go to the next slide? I'll finish with this last one. Now, I put this all together under what I call the vocation of students. I actually see being a learner as a calling, and I think that we're all called to it. And so I've challenged my students to think about their calling, and I argue to my students, my children, and I argued to my children, I made the argument or the case that I believe that we learn in order to love. And I think that there's a fundamental principle of learning to love our neighbor, and that's critically important in society, that we learn to do that and to love our neighbors, and our neighbor being pretty much anyone that we interact with, far away or close. And I challenged my daughter one day. I said, well, when you learn math, how can you use math to love your neighbor? And she was puzzled, and she came back. I came home a few days later, and she ran to the door, and she was so excited. She ran to give me a big hug. You know, dads love that, moms love that, right, when you get greeted and coming in the door. And she gives us this big hug, and she says, "Daddy, I just love my brother with math." And this was a number of years ago. And I said, "Really? Tell me how." And she said, "Well, we were kind of fighting over, and it was some toy or candy, or I forgot what it was. But she said, but I know how to add now. So we divided them into equal amounts, and he got a certain amount, and I got an amount. And we were happy together then. I love my brother with math." And I thought that was so exciting, that she actually created peace with her brother through math. And so that's one item that I'll suggest that we can kind of finish on, is this idea of creation as creating positive relationships with the people that we live with, in our families, in our communities, and beyond. I know I went close to the end here, but if people would, I'm happy to stick around for a few minutes if people have comments or questions. Also, let me just type my blog on the side. I welcome you to contact me through my blog. Also, I'm on Twitter at BGene1000, so if you want to connect with me there as well. I love to network and connect with people. I'm new to this homeschooling thing myself, so I'm always looking for people that can share ideas with me as well. Any comments or questions, feel free to type them or share them. Great. Well, thanks for all the thanks. I'll stick around just in case there are questions.
I thought I'd make a comment about a project that we're going to be working on this year that you might be interested in following a little bit. I'm the administrator, teacher, wearer of many hats at Virtual Homeschool Group. And what we're going to try this year, and hope it works out well, is have the students actually create the marine biology course. It'll be a high school level course. We have a marine biologist that will be our content expert, and we're going to teach them how to use Moodle to create their course and how to use Adobe Captivate to create interactive lessons. And so it just seems so much right in with what you were talking about, where the students will be taking an active role in creating it. And then from next year on, it'll actually be a course that other students can take. So their thumb of ownership will go on something that'll really be used.
Great. Tammy, can you type, maybe it was in there before, but could you type the address in the chat box to the website in case people would like to follow it, so we get it? I want to make sure we get it on the recording.
Sure will. Virtual Homeschool Group is an all-volunteer project where homeschool parents are creating courses and offering free courses to other homeschool families. So that's the web address right there. And up until now, it's been pretty much the homeschool moms would make the courses and then run the courses. This would be the very first time that we've experimented with letting the students actually create the course themselves. So I'm hoping it'll turn out great, because I think this would be a lot of fun for those creators among our student body.
Thanks. That sounds like a great project. I see a few more people are sticking around, so if you have any comments or questions, jump in. Otherwise, I know we have other sessions starting right now, so feel free to head out and go to those as well. I'm really interested in your, oh, Tammy left, didn't she? I'll have to follow up with her. I'm really interested in that project of the virtual homeschool, just in general. Is anyone in the room by chance, have any of you been involved with the virtual homeschool group? Great, thanks for the feedback, Nancy. Well, Debbie, it looks like we're finishing up here. How do we conclude?
You know what? I've never done it, but I'll figure it out. We need everyone to go ahead and log out, and then I will go ahead and stop the recording now, okay?
Great. Debbie, thank you. Before I head out here, thank you